Welcome back to the deep dive. We get a lot of questions about this next topic. It seems like it should be simple, but in practice, it can be anything but. Today, we're going deep on something that can trip up even seasoned professionals here in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
That's right, we're talking about at-will employment. And to help us untangle this, we've got some great insights from the Unit Consulting. They're a Texas-based HR firm that helps businesses like yours, small to mid-size, really get a handle on this whole HR landscape.
Definitely.
So what are we aiming for in this deep dive?
Well, first off, we really want to make sure everyone listening really understands what at will actually means in practice, not just, the textbook definition.
Right.
We'll dig into the exceptions. Those are super important, and we'll make sure you know how to keep your business on the right side of the law.
Okay, so let's get right into it. What is at-will employment in Texas? Give us the rundown.
Okay, so at its core, at will means that in theory, either the employer or the employee can end that employment relationship at any time, with or without a specific reason. No, drawn-out process or anything. It's just a clean break.
So, I could walk out right now if I don't know, suddenly won the lottery?
Yeah, exactly.
My boss could, let me go without a big song and dance about it?
Yep, that's the idea.
Okay.
But, and this is a big but, there are some very important exceptions. There are times when firing someone is absolutely illegal, even in Texas.
So it's not quite the Wild West out there.
Not at all.
So tell me, what are some of these exceptions we're talking about?
The big ones are discrimination, retaliation. You've got situations involving contracts and what are called public policy exceptions. Those can get a little tricky.
Okay, so let's break those down one by one. First up, discrimination. How does that play into at will?
So even though it's at will, you can't fire someone just because of things like their race, religion, gender, age, all those protected characteristics. It's got to be about skills and performance, not who they are as a person.
That makes sense. So let's say someone's doing a great job, but their boss just, doesn't like them, personality clash or something.
Yeah.
Could that be a problem?
It could be, yeah. Especially if that dislike is based on something like religion or gender or something like that.
Right.
This is where documentation is really important. You got to be able to show that decisions were based on actual performance, not bias.
Speaking of documentation, the Unit Consulting folks, they really hammered on that, even for at-will situations. Why is that so crucial?
Think of it this way. If there's ever a question about why someone was let go, having all those details written down, the good stuff, the bad stuff, any warnings or whatever, those are like receipts. They back you up.
Ah, okay, so it's protection for both sides, the employer and the employee.
Exactly.
It's like everyone knows what the rules are, and there's a record.
Yeah, and that's where having clear policies comes in too, like a good employee handbook.
Right.
It lays everything out, the expectations, how things work, all of that. That's the rule book for your workplace.
Yeah, makes sense, especially here in Texas where things can be kind of laid back. Having it all spelled out can prevent misunderstandings.
Oh, absolutely. That informality can bite you if things go south, even in an at-will state.
For sure. Okay, so we've talked about discrimination, documentation, policies. What about this retaliation thing? What does that look like in practice?
Basically, you can't punish an employee for doing something that's protected by law, like if they report a safety hazard or they file some kind of complaint.
Right.
They're protected. You can't fire them for that.
So even if it makes their boss unhappy, if they're doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Exactly.
Okay.
And this is where things can get tricky because sometimes, employers don't even realize they're doing something that could be seen as retaliation.
I can see that. So getting some expert advice could be really helpful to make sure you're not accidentally crossing any lines.
Definitely. That's where firms like the Unit Consulting come in. They really understand all the ins and outs and can help businesses stay on the right track.
Okay, so we've got discrimination, we've got retaliation. Now, what about those other two exceptions you mentioned, the contracts and public policy?
Right. So with contracts, if you've got something in writing, like a union agreement or a specific employment contract, that usually overrules the whole at-will thing.
So it's like a special rule that takes precedence.
Exactly. And then there are those public policy exceptions. These are a little more complicated.
Okay.
But basically, it means you can't fire someone for refusing to do something illegal or for doing something that's in the public interest, like a civic duty or something.
So if your boss tells you to, falsify some documents and you say no.
Perfect example.
Okay.
Or if you get called for jury duty, you can't get fired for that. It's about protecting bigger societal value.
Gotcha. So even though we're in Texas, an at-will state, there's a lot more to it than meets the eye.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important for everyone involved, employers, employees, everyone, to really understand how this all works and to get expert advice when you need it.
And speaking of expert advice, the unit consulting folks, they really seem to have a handle on this stuff. We'll come back to them a bit later. But right now, let's get practical. What does all this at-will stuff mean in a day-to-day workplace?
Good question. We should start by looking at how at-will affects things like, performance reviews, how terminations actually work, and even the overall company culture.
Sounds good. Let's get into it.
So yeah, let's talk about how this all plays out in a real workplace, not just the theory.
Right.
Let's take performance management, for example.
Okay.
In an at-will state like Texas, having a really structured performance management process is super important for employers. You've really got to get this right.
Why is that? I mean, it's at will, so what's the big deal?
Well, think about it. What if an employee isn't cutting it?
Yeah.
And you need to let them go. You need to be able to prove that you did things by the book. You gave them clear feedback, chances to improve,
Right.
all of that. You want to be able to show that it wasn't just random or, you had it out for them for some other reason.
So it goes back to those receipts we talked about.
Exactly. And it's not just about, covering yourself legally.
Going.
A good performance management system actually helps people grow and get better at their jobs.
Right.
It's about creating a culture of feedback.
That makes sense. So documentation is crucial for performance reviews and all that. But what about when it comes time to actually, let someone go?
Even with at-will, termination should always be handled professionally and, respectfully. This is another area where having clear policies is so important.
Like what kind of policies? Give us some examples.
Okay, so your employee handbook should lay out the termination process step by step.
Uh-huh.
You got to make sure all the legal requirements are met. The termination meeting itself should be handled with respect, and you need to give the employee proper documentation.
It sounds like even at will can get pretty complicated.
It can, yeah. And that's why a lot of businesses here in Texas decide to work with HR experts, firms like the Unit Consulting.
Right.
They know all the ins and outs. They can help you create these policies, train your managers, and make sure everything's done right. They really minimize your risk.
It's like having an HR safety net.
Exactly. Now let's switch gears for a minute and talk about something a lot of people worry about with at-will, workplace culture. Some people worry that at-will makes people afraid to speak up.
Oh, yeah, I can see that.
Like they're walking on eggshells because they could get fired at any moment.
Right.
And that can definitely be a concern, but it doesn't have to be that way. Even with at-will, you can still have a positive and supportive environment.
So how do you do that? How do you create that kind of culture?
It's about fostering open communication. Give employees regular feedback.
Okay.
Invest in their development and make sure things are fair and transparent. You want to build trust.
So even with at will, employees can still feel valued.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And when employees feel secure and valued, they're more engaged, they're more productive,
Right.
and they're less likely to bolt for the door as soon as another opportunity pops up. It's better for everyone.
Makes sense. Now, we've been talking a lot about the employer's side of things.
Yeah.
What about the employees?
Yeah.
What do they need to know about at will here in Texas?
Well, first and foremost, they got to realize that at-will works both ways,
Yeah, okay.
They have the right to quit their job whenever they want, with or without giving notice.
So just like that lottery win scenario.
Exactly. Of course, it's always best to be professional about it,
Right.
Don't burn any bridges.
Good point. What else should employees keep in mind?
Those legal exceptions we talked about earlier, discrimination, retaliation, contracts, all that, those still apply to employees too.
Okay.
So if they think they've been wrongfully terminated, they might have some options.
So you can't just be fired for no reason, even in Texas.
That's right. And it's important for employees to keep good records too. Performance reviews, emails, anything that might be important later on.
So it's about protecting yourself, just like employers need to protect themselves.
Exactly. And if an employee is ever unsure about their rights, or if they're in a tricky situation, they should talk to an employment lawyer.
Right.
An attorney can explain their options and, fight for them.
Kind of like how the unit consulting helps businesses.
Yeah, exactly. Knowing your rights is important.
Okay, so we've covered a lot, but I have to ask, what about wrongful termination? I mean, it seems like even with at will, things can still go wrong.
That's a great question, and you're right. Wrongful termination is a serious issue, and we need to dig into that.
Definitely.
We need to understand how it works here in Texas.
Sounds like we're getting to the heart of the matter. Hang on, folks. We'll be back in a flash after a word from our sponsor. All right, we're back, and I think it's time to tackle this whole idea of wrongful termination. It's at will here in Texas, right?
Right.
But when does letting someone go actually cross the line?
You hit the nail on the head. This is where those exceptions we've been talking about, discrimination, retaliation, public policy violations, those are the big ones. They're the grounds for wrongful termination claims, even in an at-will state.
So let's say someone listening, an employee in Texas, feels like they got fired unfairly. What can they actually do?
Well, first, they really need to think about how they were let go. Were they treated differently than other employees because of, their race, gender, or any of those protected characteristics?
Okay.
Were they fired right after reporting a safety problem or filing a complaint about something?
So they're looking for those like red flags, signs that something wasn't right.
Exactly. And if they see those red flags, they got to gather any evidence they can. Performance reviews, emails, witness statements, anything that might support their claim.
It's like they're building a case, making sure they can back up their story.
Exactly. And this is where talking to an employment lawyer is so important. An attorney can look at the situation, explain their rights, and help them, file a complaint or maybe even take legal action.
So yeah, having a legal expert on your side can make a huge difference.
Huge. Wrongful termination cases can be really complicated, and trying to figure out the legal stuff on your own is, well, it's tough.
Okay, so flipping it around, what about employers? What should they do to avoid those wrongful termination traps?
Well, one of the biggest things is consistency. Make sure you're applying your policies the same way for everyone, no matter who they are. Don't play favorites, and especially watch out for anything that could look like you're making decisions based on someone's race, gender, religion, any of those protected things.
No playing favorites, got it.
And of course, we got to say it again, documentation is key. Write down everything: performance problems, disciplinary actions, the reasons for letting someone go. Make sure it's all clear, objective, and well documented.
Those receipts are important no matter which side you're on, it seems.
Absolutely. And finally, don't forget about good communication. Keep your employees informed about policies, expectations, any changes. Be upfront and proactive.
It's about transparency, making sure everyone's on the same page.
Exactly. When you're transparent as an employer and employees feel like they're being treated fairly, that goes a long way toward preventing those wrongful termination situations in the first place.
I feel like this deep dive has been really eye-opening. It's clear that at will in Texas is a lot more complicated than it seems at first glance.
It really is. There's a lot to think about for both employers and employees. But when you understand how it works and you get some good advice when you need it, you can navigate this stuff with confidence.
And speaking of good advice, we've mentioned them a few times now. The unit consulting, they seem to really know their stuff when it comes to Texas employment law.
They do. They really do. They can help businesses set up good HR policies, train their managers, handle tricky situations, and they even help employees who have questions about their rights.
So if you're listening and you're an employer who wants to make sure you're doing things by the book, or if you're an employee who needs help understanding your rights, the unit consulting is a great resource.
Couldn't agree more. They really help make the workplace better for everyone, fairer, more transparent, and just, more successful overall.
Well said. And that's what it's all about, right? Creating a work environment that works for everyone. So that brings us to the end of our deep dive into at-will employment in Texas. We've covered a lot, the basics, the exceptions, the tricky stuff. Hopefully you're walking away from this feeling a little bit smarter and a whole lot more prepared to navigate the Texas workplace. And remember, if you're ever in a tough spot, or you just need some expert advice, don't hesitate to reach out to the unit consulting. You can give them a call at 956-230-6866 to set up a consultation and get the help you need. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And until next time, stay curious and stay informed.